by Harold Lamb. We are continuing the Turning to the East, which is chapter 11 in part 2. The guides led him west more than 180 miles from the foundations of Alexandria, so they would have passed the passed the modern El Alamein and turned inland about at Matruh before striking south into the Barrens. As it was winter then, they did not lack for water, finding pools lying in the rock. But sandstorms bewildered them, and at least once they lost their bearings. Guiding themselves at that point by the flight of ravens to the south, they gained the shelter of the olive and palm trees of the oasis, where they found cold springs and amazingly clear rock salt. What happened in the semi-darkness of the small stone sanctuary where Alexandros appealed to the oracle of Yemen-Ra as to Zeus is variously told. Alexandros himself wrote to Olympius about it afterwards, but allowed no one to see the letter. The robed priest of the sanctuary, confronting the young Macedonian, welcomed him to the presence of the godfather. One story has it that Alexandros then asked for an oracular response. Had he punished the murderers of his father as they should have been punished? Take care, said the priest, whom you name as your father. His name is Philip. The priests accepted this name and said gravely that the murderers of Philip of Macedon had met full punishment. Alexandros then asked whether he would be successful in what he undertook next, and the oracle responded that he would succeed. Alexandros made no comment. He gave gold to the priest attendants, but those who followed him to Siwa declared afterward that the oracle had pronounced him the son of Yemen, Zeus. Some say Amen is different than the Yemen of the ancient Egyptians, and anyways, a lot of games we played are the Amen number 7 of the Gahtaya. I'm not using Greek, I might as well use the Greek pronunciation. Gahtaya, not the same, but really they're the same. But some of the myths, Zeus isn't personified as a father, it's rather personified as a son who's a usurper. For some reason, either because he wanted to explore a new route or because the guides told him it was impossible, he returned to the Nile at Memphis the shortest way. This route overtook him at the southern edge of the terrible Kettera, over the clay plateau to the stagnant Fayum, but he got back. And notice how, despite how he presented himself, the priests weren't going to answer the oracle until they found out who he was to make a better educated guess. And that's not how spiritual revelation works. But it's not, okay, I'll give an answer for now that I know who you are. If you could really throw the bones or whatever they do. This was the beginning of his long and incredible journey east. Two things were happening in Egypt, hardly perceptible at first. There, Alexandros had been separated from the bulk of his army, which now that the Mediterranean campaign was over, extended in numerous settlements, shipyards, trading centers as far back as Tarsus. Some of the Macedonian farmers were experimenting with crops along the coast. The scientists were gathering specimens. The physicians had set up hospitals at the likeliest spots. Alexandros necessarily had absented himself from the mass of the army. No longer could the phalanx men see him going in and out of the adjoining quarters of Agama. The guard had to move elsewhere, escorting Alexandros, so that he did appear at a settlement on the big black horse, with a few companions. Following the men, rushed to greet him, to touch his knee, to ask what was doing next. Whenever he rode through the palm-shaded street of Memphis, the crowds drew back, declining their heads, and sometimes kneeling. For Alexandros was now the pharaoh of the Egyptians. He had not been able to escape that. Egypt might be modern in its commerce, and rice and grain agriculture, and in its shipping, yet it harked back to the tradition of the pharaohs, the great house of despots, ruling when science had advanced with such tremendous strides, harnessing the Nile waters by irrigation, calculating time itself by the movements of the constellations, raising those monumental buildings, temples and tombs, more than places, which had become the pride of modern people and visible evidence of the existence of life after death. Whoever ruled Egypt had to be a pharaoh, and a pharaoh was kin to the immortal gods, or as they called them, immortal gods. Alexandros, as pharaoh, might move among the crowds at a decent interval, or climb upon the stones of a pyramid to gaze at the gray, shining ribbon of the river. But he was indubitably a despot and considered divine. Otherwise, the Egyptians, especially this all-powerful priesthood, would have had to change their concept of their pharaoh. This gave Ptolemy, son of Lagus, and the others who kept records food for thought. It pointed to something both incredible and absurd, but nevertheless true. They compared their journal. All records agreed on this point. Alexandros had been king of the Macedonians, tribal head, as chosen by the council, and protector of the Delphi shrine. Simultaneously, he had become captain general of the Hellenes, and then overlord of the Ionian cities, military ruler of Tur and the Syrian coast, as well as the islands. Now in Egypt, he'd become a pharaoh and what people would call a god. Well, people call a lot of things, right? It may be easy to say and explain away, but the lemma observed to Anaxarchus, the Greek sophist, but when you write it down, it doesn't make sense. There is little enough of sense, Anaxarchus pointed out, in this expedition. With this Ptolemy agreed inwardly. The Macedonian commanders were intelligent and realistic individuals, quick to turn a profit or seize an opportunity. This sightseeing and discussion and building in Egypt seemed to them to be a waste of time when so much spoil was to be had for the taking. Instead, they had to treat the Egyptians more respectfully than the Ionians, who, at least, could speak Greek. What doesn't make sense is Alexandros himself. Try writing down his titles sometime. Well, he accomplished a miracle in 3 years. Did he? But Dilemma did not think that. Miracles were for the poets. The Macedonians had performed the nearly impossible by taking this eastern end of the Mediterranean within 3 years, yet it had been accomplished not by Alexandros, but because of Alexandros. Writing a few words on parchment, the general showed them to the sophist. Alexandros III, Strategos, tyrant, demagogue, pharaoh. And, after a second's hesitation, while Anaxarchus read, he added the word theos, like one who sees, but not beyond just, seeing through an organ. His titles, as from today, it's the word for God, but his titles, as from today, in their simplest form, if he can live up to all of those, it will be a miracle. Whereupon he rubbed out the written words with sand, when Hephaestion invited the two to a feast, announcing that he had received a gift for his table from Alexandros. The Greek sophist was disappointed in discovering that the gift consisted only of a basket of fish from the river. You who have accomplished great deeds, like to those of the immemorial heroes, should have greater reward than tentless fish, he said sonorously. It's as much as this table ever has, Hephaestion defended. Do you think Alexandros is altogether human? But Dilemma washed down his fish with wine, and Hephaestion answered. At Gaza, he said, Alexandros had been warned by Aristander that he would be severely injured if he joined in the attack. For some time after that, the king kept back from the danger zone, but when his men were involved in hot action on the causeway, he plunged into it and was carried out with the wall of his chest broken through. Bleeding and in pain, he had said to the companions around him, You see, that is human blood, and no ichor of the immortal gods. Blood, yes, the sophist studied Ptolemy delicately. But did he say from what father his lifeblood came? Did he ever say? When Hephaestion repeated this conversation to Alexandros, the Greek sophist was summoned to the commander's tent. He found Alexandros occupied with a writing board by a chest of record rolls. The one lamp shed a faint light on the board, but Alexandros had not troubled to move the lamp closer. In one corner stood the dark shield that was supposed to have been the shield of Achilles. It bore no mark of having been used in battle. Carry my greeting to the Athenians, said Alexandros, and this. Scrawling his signature on the square parchment, he held a tub of wax over the lamp flame for a minute. Pressing the soft wax down at the end of the signature, he wanted a second, then licked the surface of his seal ring and pressed it in the wax, and gave the sophist the parchment. Anaxarchus had to hold it close to the lamp to read it. It was a grant of the island of Samos to the city of Athens. The signature, Alexandros Strategos. The grant, then, was from the captain general of the Hellenes. Startled, Anaxarchus muttered something about a royal gift. It is not my gift. It is the gift of my lord and father, Philip of Macedon. Alexandros waited, but the sophist made no comment on that. I heard him say once that Samos should belong to the Athenians. The sophist began to say that the Athenians knew how to be grateful. After a moment, he felt that the Macedonian was only half listening, his head on one side, his long legs stretched out towards the shield. He waited patiently, as if for something he did not hear. Then he stirred restlessly and asked, What is Demosthenes doing? Anaxarchus did not think he meant this to be an insinuation. He simply asked the question. Actually, Demosthenes, in favor again, was still speaking against the Macedonian tyranny, and Anaxarchus suspected that Alexandros knew this well enough. He only said, "The orator is not as young as he was. Few people share his opinion now." This last was a lie. Alexandros nodded, as if satisfied, and the sophist took the nod as a sign to leave. On his journey home across the sea, he thought often and carefully about his own remark concerning the fish, suspecting that Alexandros had been testing him in some way, but Alexandros had done no more than to give him the deed to Samos and ask about Demosthenes. When Parmenio came down from Tours, Perdiccas told him that he had no army now. Instead, he had taxis of military settlers breeding children on these eastern women and raising strange fruits and grains. They were even planting wine grapes here that they had gotten somehow from home. Parmenio, however, had other worries. Harpalus, a calculating miser, had absconded from Sartes, with the treasury taking refuge, like a fool, on an island. Then, when he had been brought back after some trouble, Alexandros had not only refused to punish him, but had reinstated him as treasurer, saying that he did not think Harpalus would make the same mistake again. Well, another man might. There is no discipline outside the army camps, but Lemma was petulant. Every peasant and caravan broker does as he feels like. He washes his backside in a fountain, while a Macedonian soldier waits to fill a water jug. If a Phoenician girl wants to fill her jug, a soldier can't even touch her. And if you want a horse, you have to pay for one. You even pay a horse thief. And with what? We have plenty of good Asiatic gold coins for once, but they're not so good. Alexandros made the Athenian owls standard, so our gold isn't worth its weight as coinage. The dealers here weigh our gold coins and give us no more than 11 for one. What's the current rate of silver to gold? Yeah, it's not that bad. It's not 11 to 1. It seemed to Parmenio and to most of the officers that Alexandros was disciplining the military in order to let the inhabitants do exactly as they pleased. He took pains not to change their native ways. In Memphis, he offered sacrifice to Yemenrah, as he had sacrificed to Zeus at Pella. He had not shifted one palm tree or horse block in the broad streets of Memphis. He had only bridged the Nile here at this city. Instead, he had laid down a great new metropolis, Alexandria upon sand and marsh, and a lighthouse island. Alexandros granted all the requests of the emissaries, who now flocked to his tent like eagles, citing food to be picked up. He released the last of the war prisoners, and settled them in Gaza and Tur. When the Arabian tribes of the interior asked for a governor, he named an Eastern Greek and warned him, don't make any change in their customs. In fact, from Ilium, is that how you say Troy? True. To Memphis, Alexandros had made no change in the local governments. Although supposedly pharaoh of the rich land of the Nile, he left it in charge of 2 Egyptians, attaching only 2 Macedonian officers and a sea captain to this Memphis administration. As advisors, security officers in Libya, he posted a fiscal officer, studying Alexandros' measures of control for this great Mediterranean Sea. The astute and experienced Parmenio could detect only new departure. In each land, collectors had been appointed who were independent of military control. The modern payments these treasurers gathered in were used for road and bridge buildings, for hospital equipment, and even for new water clocks. So all along the coast, the garrison officers had no control over the money. If they wanted funds, they had to send requests to Sartes. With this unusual measure, Parmenio had no quarrel, but he foresaw that it would lead to trouble if ever Alexandros should be absent from the coast for long. He recalled Aristotle's saying, "It is more difficult to organize peace than to win a war, but the fruits of victory in war will be lost if the peace is not well organized." But the organization, such as it was, of Alexandros's new Mediterranean world resembled no rule or government hitherto known. To be certain of that, Parmenio noted down all the types of government known to the Greek world as Aristotle listed them, and the list showed polis, city-state, ruled by representation of all educated citizens; democracy, ruled by the propertyless masses; aristocracy, ruled by the small minority of the best men; oligarchy, ruled by the small minority of the privileged and the owners of wealth; monarchy, ruled by the one most gifted individual; tyranny, ruled by the one individual who has seized military power. Study this list as he might, the chief of staff could not fit Alexandros's imperium into any of its variations. He recalled that Aristotle had believed that the most workable form of government lay somewhere between an oligarchy and democracy. Then, too, he remembered vaguely that Aristotle had believed it to be useless to set up an ideal form of government. You had to start with the best workable form, improving it not by statute, but by improving the conditions by which it was shaped. With this thesis, Parmenio agreed, yet it seemed to him too difficult to put into practice. Philip, he thought, would not have attempted it. Philip had wrested tangible benefits for the Macedonians: silver mines, seaports, military control. What frightened Parmenio was that Alexandros's imperium appeared nameless, and his actions certainly seemed aimless. For 3 years he had drawn one half of the young manpower of Macedon out of the land, and that time he had sent back only letters and trophies and enough bullion to pay Antipater's expenses. Here on the east coast he was building roads, shipyards, pouring medicines into hospitals, designing academies, gymnasiums, theaters for the future. He was working with strange peoples here, apparently to improve conditions, shaping their lives, so far as it made sense. This was the sense of his conduct. He was shaping the whole Mediterranean world by changing the conditions in which it had existed. And if you refer this to like the Taliban was better in their seizing control, but the way that they ruled, they didn't set up the education and all this other stuff. That and things turned sour when they realized just how much control they had. And that, to Parmenio's thinking, was not sense, but absurdity. It was worse than setting up a Platonic republic in which men cultivated virtue by the process of acquiring knowledge. Parmenio knew well enough by experience that human beings did not cultivate virtue when they acquired more knowledge. They were more apt to cultivate vices. Alexandros knew this. Well, the more evil that's possible. Weary of trying to visualize a plan in what they were doing, Parmenio went, as always, to Alexandros. He asked about a tangible point, something that could be grasped and held to. Why did Alexandros continue to sign orders as Captain General of the Hellenic League when the project of the Hellenic League had broken down almost as soon as they crossed the Hellespont? Alexandros signed as Captain General because he was that, officially still. But even the Greeks themselves did not believe in the Hellenic League idea, and never spoke of it. Indeed, they had made orations about their civic liberties. Yes, Alexandros knew that. Then why hold to the pretense instead of reality? Philip had planned something real, a Macedonian monarchy, superimposed upon a united Greece. Macedonian rule could unite Greece, not without sacrificing the independence of the individual cities, of the polis. If you united Greece, you put an end to the city-state. The weakness of the city-state was that it could not extend itself to protect Greece. It tried to do this by forming leagues, which soon broke down. Given protection from outside, the individual city-state could continue to exist. Athens, for example, and it would torture him if Athens should cease to be Athens in order to become a city of a united Greece. Torture? Torture whom? The chief of staff demanded, puzzled. You? Philip's ghost? Demosthenes. Parmenio gave up his exploration of this dangerous level of inquiry into Alexandros' mentality. Demosthenes, he said curtly, has abandoned his Philippics only because he now has Alexandros as the object of his hatred. If you want to be an individualist, you will find Demosthenes will keep you company. And when Alexandros did not respond to this touch of irony, Parmenio tried ridicule. A few days ago, you gave an order after consulting me. It directed the commander of the Cuprus fleet of galleys to proceed with 100 ships towards the southern coast of Greece and cruise off Spartan territory, ostensibly to watch for pirates, actually to observe any attempt of the Spartans who were still allied to the great king to assemble a fleet. You gave this order, and I heard it, as Captain General, which you are not, of the Hellenic League, which you have just admitted does not and cannot exist. Why? Alexandros answered at once, seriously, because the Spartans are stupidly proud. If they thought the fleet was sent against them, they would stand to arms indefinitely along their coast. Do you think that there is a better way to work it? Parmenio gave up his probing. It seemed to him that Alexandros had no plan, and they were all drifting from opportunity to opportunity, doing whatever seemed to work out best at the time. This suited unthinking men like Nearchus perfectly, but Ptolemy had an opinion of his own. He thought Alexandros was going through a process of self-mortification, perhaps to atone for Philip's death. Imitating Heracles, their commander, labored for the sake of laboring. Certainly he did not bear himself like an offspring of the gods. Worse than that, he seemed to think of himself now as an agent of something, but of what? Only the gods knew. The men in ranks had no such misgiving. Whenever Alexandros appeared among them, they raised a shout. An alias. Ptolemy turned his back on Memphis reluctantly. When he rode across the new bridge, he looked over often at the soaring pylons and the pyramid tips rising from the plain. Memphis seemed to him calm as a lovely sleeping woman. In Memphis he had found Thais, who somehow combined the innocent appearance of a girl with a spiritual savor of a priestess and her skill as a prostitute. A lot of cultures, a girlfriend and a prostitute was, I guess, the same thing. But, not quite the same thing, right? Early that spring, the Macedonian army was gathering by order at the new base of Turr, and that Turr occupied the first bitter quarrel between Alexandros and Parmenio, and many of the staff. That winter the great king had offered terms of peace, simple enough and apparently sincere, that would ransom his wife and family from the Macedonians. For 10,000 talents, he would cement friendship between Alexandros and himself by offering one of his daughters in marriage. He would surrender all the territory between the boundary river, Euphrates, and the Greek seas. The quarrel between commander and chief of staff on this issue, handed down through the historians by this passage. Parmenio says, "If I were Alexandros, I would accept peace on those terms." Alexandros said, "So would I, if I were Parmenio." Reading beyond these words, it is clear that a decisive conflict of opinion divided the Macedonian planners in the spring of 331 BCE at Tours. Conservative council pointed out that they had fulfilled all Philip's plan, and Isocrates and more. Including the Balkans, the Macedonians had taken over about 9 times the extent of their original territory. They had no further reservoir of manpower at home upon which to draw. They were, on the contrary, fairly secure along this coast, where they had the desert at their backs, except for the fertile northern belt around the headwaters of the Euphrates. They had enough. Why risk what they had to gain more? The risk-takers felt that nothing remained secure so long as the main Persian army existed inland. Until that army was eliminated, they could only hold the coast on sufferance. What Alexandros said is not known. What he did was to order an advance eastward. The decision marked a change in Macedonian affairs. Alexandros had imposed his will on the veteran generals and companion nobles. The army moved henceforth as he directed. After that conference at Tours, a change is noticeable in Parmenio's behavior. He merely carried out tactical orders as directed, and before another year ended, he was left behind in command of a base. From that time on, Alexandros depended more upon the advance of the younger minds, Hephaestion's Ptolemy, and even upon Perdiccas's and Nearchus's. At Tours, Alexandros could have no conception of how far he would need to journey in the east, nor of all that lay beyond the Euphrates and Babylon. For one thing, he had no maps to show him the true size and configuration of the continental mass ahead. For another, he was leaving the area known to Greek traders and settlers. In the way of texts, he had only Herodotus's colorful narrative and the Anabasis of Xenophon, the world plan of Hecataeus. Now moving inland around Mount Hermon, passing through Damascus, he angled sharply north to keep the fringe of good grazing and to avoid the heat of the central Syrian plain. So he crossed the Euphrates on bridges already prepared, where it was little more than a sluggish stream near its source.